Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Fitzgerald, and welcome to the Men of Principle podcast. Today, I have an incredible guest on the show today. His name is Drew Weatherhead. Drew is a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, a husband, a father of four, an author, a creator of Business Jiu-Jitsu page, and a digital nomad. Ladies and gentlemen, Drew Weatherhead. Hey, Drew,
How's
how's
it
it
going,
going?
Rich? Nice. Yeah,
Good.
it's good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for being here. And so, I mentioned just a minute ago that, you're a jiu-jitsu black belt. When
Mhm.
did you start training jiu-jitsu, and what made you start training in the first place?
2007 was the year that I started, and I stumbled upon it by accident. It wasn't because I didn't know it existed, but I was already doing other martial arts. So I started doing martial arts when I was 18 with karate, like most people start, right? Either karate or
Hmm.
taekwondo is usually the entry drug to get in. And
Yeah.
then I decided because UFC was still going on at that point, and I was watching it as like, oh, this is the pinnacle of martial arts. So I decided that I need to round up my martial arts. So I got a striking style, wasn't that good at it, but I got a striking style, and I'm going to add a weapon style next. So I'm going to be a badass like Jackie Chan. And I went into Kali, which is Filipino weapon style. So I started stick fighting for a couple years. And what I kind of noticed in the background, my subconscious definitely knew, but consciously I wouldn't let myself believe it, is that this stuff is all well and good in theory, but what we're doing is pulling our punches in karate and using foam bats in Cali, and like all of this stuff is theoretical, right?
Hmm.
I'm just presuming that it's going to work because my master says it's going to work when I need it. So I'm going to keep this stuff in my back pocket. And I'm such a badass, but I've never had to prove it. Um, I had a friend who I still have a friend, but we were in a band at the time. He was the drummer, and he was the jujitsu guy of the friend group. And by that, I mean he had taken, I think, 2 weeks of jujitsu at a garage somewhere under a Japanese jujitsu guy, and he got some VHS tapes from Brazil, some Vale
Hmm.
Tudo stuff. So
Hmm.
really, like he knew how to do a rear naked choke, a triangle, and armbar, which meant he was a jujitsu guy. That was
Yeah.
magic. Those were magic tricks. Nobody knew how to do a triangle choke. Like, what is even happening when that happens? So we would like trampoline wrestle and lawn wrestle in the back. Like we were 19, 20 years old, kind of just goofing around. But there was a Christmas party where I brought some of these foam bats from Cali, and I was like, we should screw around. So we went down in the basement. I'm like, all right, let's Cali fight. So I toss him a foam bat, and we start going whack 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 and doing the Cali thing. And
Hmm.
I don't know if I was winning or if he was just getting bored or frustrated, but he just threw the bat at my head and double legged me to the ground. So now it's something different. I'm like, oh, weird. And we're scrambling. And when I say he's the jujitsu guy, it doesn't mean that he is great at jujitsu. He just knows that he can use it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And we scramble till I'm in his close guard on top. And as far as he's concerned, he's won already at this point. He's got me in a close guard, and I don't know what I'm doing. But
Hmm.
I had one trick that I didn't even know I had, because in Cali, they've got a couple joint locks that they use for disarming. And this one they call it a hammer lock, which is an Americana, where
Hmm.
I grab the wrist, I figure four, and I pull his arm back. And I was like, I got nothing else in this position. I'm trapped between this fucker's legs. I'm going to grab his wrist, pull this arm, and he taps. And I couldn't believe it. Like, I just made the jujitsu guy tap. Like, that's not supposed to be possible. I'm supposed to have a judge here to tell me whether I won or not. Like, he
Hmm.
just admitted to me that he lost. This is something that's different. This is pure. This is a new level of martial arts. I'm like, the very next day, to date myself, I went into the yellow pages and found the only jujitsu place in town, which was at a garage. And I trained there until I was a brown belt.
Wow. So then you actually started a gym a while back, right? Was that right after you got your brown belt, or were you already a black belt, or when did that start?
I was a brown belt at that point. I think I had the gym for about a year, year and a half before I got my black. But yeah, I moved, I guess, laterally from career in welding, which I had done for 15 years before that, and moved into an entrepreneurial position. I'd never owned a business in my life, but I knew that I had a passion for jujitsu, and I was willing to go for it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I know you and I, we were talking about a little bit about it earlier. We've been connected for a few years now. I think we really talked a ton, especially in like 2020, 2021, when the pandemic was hot and heavy.
Mhm.
So obviously we mentioned earlier, you used to have a gym. So can you give our listeners a little background as to how you don't have one now and kind of how that came to be and what happened?
Sure. So, just for a little bit of background too, is this was in Alberta, Canada. And so, if you weren't in Canada during the pandemic, you probably had a different flavor of pandemic because up here was pretty rough. I'm not going to say it's the
Mhm.
roughest in the world, but it was up in the top 5 for first world countries of places you didn't want to be during the pandemic. Now, that being said, Alberta was probably the best of all the provinces to be in Canada. It had the most yeehaw energy, but it all wilted after time. You know, it was just too much time.
Mhm.
By late maybe fall of 2020, every province was in lockstep with the Fed at that point, and they were, you know, mask this, distance that, lockdowns, shutdowns, restrictions, mandates, essential, blah blah blah. So it, I moved from the trades, which were up and down and up and down. You know, you have boom and bust in the trades for 15 years. And I was like, I'm going to get out of this into something that I can do, an artistic endeavor that is only going to be limited by my motivation. And I'm going to make sure that I make it. And lo and behold, it go figure that a year and a half into that process, a worldwide pandemic happens where you aren't allowed to touch people. So all of a sudden, jujitsu wasn't that viable, where legally, they would fine me $50,000 if I held a single class. So, under those pretenses, and of course, under the supposition of 2 weeks to flatten the curve, I was like, sure, yeah, I'll shut down for 2 weeks. We're going to be safe. There's this zombie plague going around. Everybody's going to die. So, we're going to make sure to save grandma and hide in our hidey holes for about a 2 week period. And, you know, we'll come back and I'll see you guys. You know, if I'll even give you a discount on the month when you come back because you missed a couple of weeks, is kind of how I'm thinking, right?
Mhm.
Well, we're coming up to like 10 days out of those 14 days, and they say, we don't like the numbers. We're going to need to do 4 more weeks. I'm like, whoa. First of all, how bad is this? Second of all, that's a lot more than I was expecting. Now I'm like 2 months down on income. Okay, this is kind of crazy.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I can go through all the details, but essentially it was a never-ending, perpetual, indefinite, wait for the numbers, next 4 weeks, next 8 weeks. We don't like that. We're gonna have to stay home over Christmas, no Easter, and it just kept on going and going and going for essentially 16 and a half months of you need to pay your bills, but you aren't allowed to make money.
Mhm.
And that doesn't work very long. It wasn't supposed to work as long as it did. I pulled magic hats, rabbits out for months on end of here's a conundrum for you, and suggest your listeners run this scenario in their head theoretically and then go try to do it realistically. You need to pay somewhere between five to $10,000 this month, and you aren't allowed to make money at your job. Go. Now do that once. Now do that 4 times. Now continue to do that, and just we're going to tell you when to stop, and they never tell
Mhm.
you when to stop. And so that was basically a situation I was in, that by about May of 2021, I had to pull a plug, and we had pulled every trick. We had taken every loan. We had, you know, burned through our savings. We were basically at the end of our rope where we were going to sell our house. And my I was willing to do it. I was willing to go down on my shield, and my wife actually pulled me aside and said, "Look, I I know what you're doing, and I respect all of the effort and the sacrifice that you're putting into this thing, but um, we need to reassess what's happening here because it's one thing if it was just you, but we got our whole family here. We can't go out on the street for this, you know." And so
Mhm.
we had a hard talk and had to make a hard decision to not only uh, kill the gym at that point, which I had blood and tears for 3 years to try to keep this thing alive. Um, and then on top of that, we had to sell the house anyways because we had no money. So we made the decision to fold the business, sell our house, and move our entire family into a travel trailer where we've lived full time on the road for the last 2 years.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, like you said, I mean, most people can't go a month without income. And as a business owner, you're asked to go multiple months, some people over a year. It's unfathomable what they expected people to do. And, I know the United States wasn't quite as bad as Canada, but I mean, there were some cities that were still locked. I think like New York City was
New York
locked
was
down for,
bad, yeah. LA
yeah,
was bad.
yeah. And I know for us, even it was like, for a period of time, it was basically like underground railroad type stuff. Like,
Hmm.
you don't tell anybody you're training, but you're training, because you just
Yeah,
got to
I
get
had
through
some
it.
periods of that. There was a few months in there when I mean, at a certain point, like I was trying to play by the rules as much as I could, partly because I'm not a I'm not a lawbreaker. I don't consider
Yeah.
myself that. I consider myself an upright citizen as far as the law is concerned. But, there's a certain point along the way where not only was I like, this is beyond ridiculous, but I had, what was, I can speak about it now because it's so long past and everybody understands the ridiculousness of it all.
Mm-hmm.
Is there was a point when we were still considered non-essential and we're supposed to be locked down, and again, $50,000 if you get caught once and $50,000 if you get caught twice, and like, this is, I had no money to risk that to begin with. But at a certain point, there was one of my students. I have a number of students that are first responders that are either in police or ambulance or security, and they use their jujitsu at their job, and they
Mm-hmm.
hadn't trained for like 10 months at this point. And it's there was an incident where one of my police officer students just about got killed one night, where he got jumped by a meth head with a gun, and he basically messaged me 3 a.m. in the morning. He's shaking, like he had just basically survived something he wasn't supposed to survive. And he told me like all the moves, all the jujitsu moves he used. But then he also said, I felt rusty, Drew, like really rusty. Like none of my moves felt good. They felt slow, clunky. It was more of a struggle. I was more out of breath than I should have been. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought that I had these things in the bank, but I hadn't used them for almost a year, at least not in a training scenario where I had to go against a resisting opponent. And
Mm-hmm.
it was that for me that I was like, you know what? I'm willing to take the risk now. I don't care if they come and sanction me. I don't care if they come and arrest me. I don't care. These people are out there considered essential, and you're not going to let them make sure that they can protect themselves and other
Mm-hmm.
people and you, and you're going to, like, for the sake of a nasty cold, you're going to do that. No, like, these people have families too, and they need to come home safe at night. So I was like, anybody who's willing to come train, we're going to put up mats in front of the windows, and we're going to be, parking in the back, but just come and train, because I got nothing to do here anyways. This shit doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that you guys who need it are getting it. And part of it too, like, part of people needed it for their jobs, but again, another 50% of the people that came back, which was only 50% of the people, it wasn't enough to make the bills,
Mm-hmm.
were people that just psychologically needed it. They're like, I have been trapped and isolated for so long, and I like, Drew, I want to end it all at this point. I need some sort of outlet. And they were serious, like, they're in some serious existential crisis. And by that point, I had known people who had taken their life too. I'm like, I don't take this lightly when people
Mm-hmm.
say that they're in a really bad psychological spot, especially for men, like, that takes, you have to be on the edge of a knife to admit to another man that you're considering something like that. Usually
100%.
people don't even say it, so
Yeah,
for someone to say that to me, you better damn well take that serious.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you said it so perfectly. I mean, there are so many unquantifiable metrics as to why jiu-jitsu is so good for us, right? And it's people who don't train, they won't understand. Those people who are listening, they don't quite get it, right? But for those of us who train, it's like, man, for many people, it's a stress relief. It's a way to reduce your anxiety. It's a way to maintain relationships and friendships with people. For a lot of people, that's like literally their only socialism that they have in their life.
Mhm.
It's like it goes beyond just self-defense.
Yeah,
And
way
we'll
beyond.
never know how many people don't commit suicide because of it, but we know
Mhm.
it's a large number. We know it's significant. And I know for me, like, I just hurt my ribs last Saturday, so it's been like 5 days I've been able to roll. I'm already losing my mind. Like, how do people go months sometimes if that is their only outlet? So
Yeah.
I applaud you for trying to hold out as long as you did, and so many other people in that same predicament, unfortunately. And speaking of COVID, one thing you and I are both passionate about, I know, is the freedom to choose like what to put in your body.
Mhm.
And I know you and I have both talked before, or at least on our podcast or other means, that we both chose to go against the jab, right? And I heard your newest podcast earlier today on the Social Disorder podcast, which was fantastic, by the way. So for those of you listening, go listen to that after you're done listening to this. But some people will say we shouldn't talk about politics. A lot of people always say it's like controversial, but I feel that real men who are who want to take care of their families, who want to make good decisions, they're willing to speak out against leaders regardless of who they are if what they're doing is immoral. Would you agree with that?
Not only should they, I don't know if they have a choice, to be honest. Like, I don't think
Yeah.
you can consider yourself a good person if you have a conviction you aren't willing to stand up for.
Yeah. So what made you start talking about those tough topics on your podcast? Because you've been doing it for a while now, right?
Yeah, I've been doing it for about a year, year and a half or so. I'm coming up on 300 episodes next week, so I've
Wow.
been busy. It's
Yeah,
5 times a
congratulations. That's a
week.
that's a huge milestone.
Yeah, yeah, it's big. But again, there was a certain amount, like, I wasn't one of those people. And I speak to this on the show too. There's levels of personality as it pertains to natural traits that you have predispositions to when it
Mhm,
comes to risk. How risk averse, how risk tolerant are you? And I probably put myself onto the risk tolerant side of that spectrum, but not so far that I'm like one of these crazy guys that's like the first person to be fighting back against the man without considering anything. Like, I put a lot of thought into these things before I decide to risk something like my reputation, my job, my whatever,
mhm,
all of the above, right? And but there was a point where I made that decision. It was early into 2022 where I was like, not only do all the people in my life kind of know where I stand now, but that's not enough. I need to make my voice public. I'm willing to risk what at that point was the major income for my family still, which came through my Instagram page because Jitsu. That's where I get a lot of my marketing through for selling all sorts of different products. And at that point, at basically the end of 2021, which was the worst year of the pandemic, looking back retrospectively, if you had a counter narrative view in 2021, you were absolutely ostracized, you were deplatformed, you're devenerated.
mhm,
Coming into early 2022, it was no different, and I'd made my decision by coincidentally, the day before Canada invoked the Emergencies Act on the protests in Ottawa, the day before that, I decided to go live with my first podcast called The Elephant in the Room. And it was exactly all the things that everybody was talking about that weren't willing to talk about it publicly. I'm like, I'm going to talk about them all now
mhm,
because, first of all, they needed to be before I did. I wish I had earlier, but there's no reason morally why I can withstand that anymore. I'm willing to risk it all. And part of that had to do with the stuff I had been through. Part of that had been through watching what others had been through,
mhm,
including people in my family, like my older sister. She was paralyzed from the Pfizer shot and she lost the use of her legs for over 10 months. And I wasn't allowed to talk about it. She wasn't allowed to talk about it. The doctors that were treating her told her that she was crazy if she brought it up. It took her 10 months and a neurologist willing to write it down on a piece of paper for her to be allowed to believe what happened to her. And all of this stuff is happening in the background while I'm just supposed to pretend like everything is all well and good. I don't have a gym anymore. I'm living on the road. I barely scrape an income to support my family, but at least we're not talking about what's important.
mhm,
Like there's just so much of that you can take where I was like, I have to. It was more of one of those principle things too. Is like I can't live with myself. I can't sleep at night knowing that I'm not doing what I should, and I just feel like what I should be doing is speaking about these things that matter to me. So I don't care how many people don't want to hear it, but I do care about how many people do want to hear it. And I think there's more of those people out there than are willing to publicly tell me. So I did.
mhm,
I put it out there. I lost a lot of friends. I had a lot of nasty messages from people, but I also had a lot of people that were encouraged by it, and a lot of people that came out saying, I thought I was the only one. I'm so glad there's more than one. I'm like, there's more than one. You're one of like 10 people that contact me today, like there's a lot of people out there. And part of the pernicious part of the propaganda cycle and the mass formation that happened over these massive media and government and medical pressures that got put down society was the atomization of society. And that
mhm,
is, I mean, for anybody who looks at social constructs historically, they know that one of the prerequisites for any sort of totalitarian government to arise is the atomization of its constituents, of its people's constituents, I should say. That is a prerequisite, and it's written right into the Marxist Manifesto. It's written like this. People know this. This isn't an accident that this happened. So when it started happening and people started becoming isolated in their tiny little one person or two person groups in their house for a year at a time. Like,
mhm,
no wonder we were so easy to control and to manipulate. And just the understanding that you weren't alone in that one little bubble, and maybe there were people in the cell next to you that believed the same thing you did, that had power at a social level, at a psychic cognitive level that I think it unleashed a lot of the weight and the burden that was on people's backs.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And it's interesting because both you and I have another thing in common, right? So you mentioned, or I mentioned about you earlier, that you're a husband and a father of four. I'm married. I also have three sons. With all the craziness going on in the world today, what type of example are you trying to set for your family? Because I know for me, like, there's a lot of situations that come up in which I think maybe if I were single and younger with no children, it'd be easier to keep my mouth shut, maybe. But
Mm,
as more and more issues arise that have a potential to affect my children, I'm more vocal about it. Like I'm
yeah.
more vocal because I want people to understand, like, dude, I do not appreciate and respect what you're trying to do to my children.
Mhm.
So do you have any like priorities in particular when it comes to like how to raise your children? Do you have anything or a set of principles that you're trying to instill in them?
Well, thankfully, even before COVID, and I mean, there was such a learning curve that happened during that when I was trying to suss out what exactly was happening in real time. And as it turns out, history actually well informed what was going on. The more you learned about history, the more you learned about the present.
Hmm.
Um, but thankfully, before that, I was already homeschooling all my kids that were old enough to school anyways. So they were already insulated from a lot of that, I guess, public side of the education system and all of the indoctrination involved in it. So there's this, I guess you can come at this two ways. And the way that I primarily and my wife primarily have come at it is we actually try to allow them to enjoy a pretty regular upbringing. I don't actually want them to know how crazy the world is at this age because they're between the ages of 4 and 11. Like the 11-year-old is just starting to understand uh, societal interaction to, a degree that she can understand that what even a government is. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
don't I don't want to, as much as I can make it seem like it wasn't a big deal and we just had this cool adventure and we got to go on vacations a lot, and they can look back and then I can sort of explain maybe when they're 16 or 18 kind of like what they lived through and the importance of it. Um, so partly that was what I was trying to do, is trying to make it that they weren't living through one of the craziest times in history. I mean, there's some things that you couldn't avoid because you had to swab their nose to get on an airplane and stuff
Yeah.
like that. But um, the other side of it too is to speak to leaving a legacy. Is I've got hundreds of hours of not only my voice but my thoughts about everything in real time while it happened, that should be there for posterity, that they can go back when they're older and actually listen to it in this sort of time capsule way, and they can understand what I thought and why I did what I did when I did it, and maybe transpose that back to what they remember when they were a kid. And I think that that's going to be a powerful way that they can understand and get the benefit of all of the craziness that's happened here without having it to be psychically carried around as a young person, and hopefully not scar them in a way that grows them up too fast.
Mhm. Man, that's awesome. Never even thought about the fact that, like, so I put out a podcast. Obviously, you're way ahead of me, almost hitting 300 episodes already. But I've never thought about it until you just said it, that you have hours and hours of content in which your children can go back to and listen to and know that
Mhm.
this is my dad's moral fiber. I had another guest on earlier. His name is Martin Thomas. He's another jiu-jitsu black belt. And he also has a podcast called Process Over Prize. Great brand. And he told me something that was very interesting, that he will record his voice, and he would sometimes, like, before he would deploy or whatever, he would, like, read stories to his children so they would hear it. And then now he still will tell them things. He will leave a journal basically for
Mm,
them to know what his thoughts were as a grown man. So that way, when they grow up, they know what their dad was going through. I think that's
yeah.
pretty cool. And man, I've never really thought about the very podcast we're doing right now. Our children can listen to later and
Yeah.
really hear what men are thinking, right? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's
Um,
that's not only cool, it's so important. I know
it is.
people, and I've heard stories of, either parents that died young and all their kids have left is like a recording on an answering machine that they never delete, kind of thing, so that they can understand and remember their voice and it doesn't disappear. We don't have to worry about that, unless a solar flare happens that wipes out all hard drives everywhere. We are stuck on the internet for hours and hours, hundreds of hours, that they
Mhm,
can really at an acute level know who we are, which I think that a lot of kids, including myself, looking back on my parents, I don't think that I know them as well as my kids have the opportunity to know me, you know?
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So Okay, so you're an author, right? You have a hilarious, I mean, I don't want to call it a meme page, but the
No, it
majority of the
is. That's
content
what it
are
is.
hilarious memes.
Yeah.
I think that's actually one of the ways I discovered you.
Hmm.
You're a podcast host. You're always putting out new jiu-jitsu content. So you're obviously a huge entrepreneur, right?
Hmm.
How do you make the time to do all that you do? And what advice would you give to men out there who want to get out of their traditional 9 to 5s?
Yeah, that's a great, great topic right there. It's something that I spend almost a third of the book that I wrote detailing. And it's something that I think it should be a universal understanding. I think that this should be a well understood, well worn, beaten path that leads people on a ever more progressive uh, journey towards not only self discovery, but um, they say they talk about the pursuit of happiness. You ever see that movie, The Pursuit of Happiness, with
Yep.
Will Smith? And he's got
Yep.
that scene in there where he said he's talking about the Declaration and how Jefferson knew. How did he know to put the pursuit part in there, as if it was something that you could never actually get?
Mm-hmm.
And that's right. That's true. That happiness shouldn't be the goal. It should be a contentness, and you can be content in misery. Like there is something to be said. That's the entire Buddhist tradition. That's the entire Taoist tradition, Stoic tradition, is being able to um, hold yourself tall under suffering. That
Mm-hmm.
itself is contentment. And happiness has very little, if anything, to do with that. And happiness is a bit of a wisp in the willows. It's a smoke in the wind. It disappears as fast as it arrives. It's basically a hormonal response. You can't just chase a hormonal response. You need something with more substance than that. And so, to get back to the point, um, for me, when it comes to content creation, which is broadly what I do, I create jujitsu content, whether it be jokes, whether it be technique videos, whether I create a book, whether I create a podcast, is all versions of content creation. I'm a creator, and realistically, everybody is a creator to whatever degree they want to be.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's this idea that I have in my book and I've put into my podcast too. I call it the mind of the ant. And not to get too deeply into it because I detail it more in those places, but if you were to consider a single solitary ant, which is a paradox in and of itself, it's a conundrum, it's a dichotomy that shouldn't exist. It is a single solitary unit of existence, a single animal that is actually part of a superorganism. So by itself, it is itself, but communally, it's something else. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't even realize that it is the superorganism that it is, and yet it still is that thing, whether it realizes it or not. And so, what I mean when I say that is get without fail, if you get enough ants together and without any ant overlord telling them what to do, they will create something that is an engineering marvel. An ant hill is an absolute engineering marvel. They've got specific shafts that bring in air, certain ones that are for egg chambers and queen's layers, and they just create this. And not a single one of them knows the entire architecture of it, but without fail, they were created as a community. But at the same time, you look at that individual ant, and now you're looking at something that is that part of a superorganism, but is itself at the same time. So if you consider yourself in the place of the ant, what is it that causes that ant to go do the thing that it does that ends up becoming this great masterpiece as a community over time? Because it's not on purpose, but
Mm-hmm.
there is something that drives it and something universal that drives every individual one of them, not only in each nest, but in every nest around the world. And I think, like, I transpose myself psychologically and philosophically into the mind of an ant, simple as it is. And I have to believe that the only thing that drives it to do all the things that lead to this masterpiece over time is that it is constantly after the thing that it wants to do the most. Whatever that is, it may be
Mm-hmm.
going to get water, it may be picking up this stick, it may be fighting this other bug, but whatever it is, it wants to do that more than anything else in the world. Otherwise, it wouldn't do it. It doesn't have the capacity to have that type of reasoning. And so, if you transpose that again back into humanity, what everybody should ask themselves, what is the thing that you most want to do? First of all, I don't think it's an accident. I think that that's the thing that you will find fulfillment in more than any other thing. And it's
Mm-hmm.
the old adage that if you find something, if you find a job that, how does it go? You want to do. I'm going to do the George W. Bush thing where I screw it all up.
You never work a day in
Find
your
a
life.
job.
Is that the one
Yeah,
you're talking
that's
about?
the one. Find a job that you love doing and you'll never work a day in your life, something like
Yeah.
that. And it comes down to the mind of the ant. This is what you would be doing whether you were paid for it or not. And so you can start that. You can, and I go through this all in my book. You can start doing something that you hate and work towards something that you love on the side. And eventually you will off ramp onto that thing because you start building this ant nest, something beautiful over time, which is just an aggregation of community effort with yourself. It's just
Mhm.
me today, me tomorrow, me the next day, all of these me's building up all of these things that are building this thing that I didn't have before. And all of a sudden it will become large enough and proportionate enough to not only off ramp my entire career into, but maybe build something for posterity that is marvelous. Look at all the things that Elon Musk built. You know what I mean? Like this is all from the intellect of one man, but it wasn't just like he woke up one day and discovered it all. This is all just attrition and work over time. And he is as driven a person as you've ever met about all the things that he loves. But you don't see him going out and, becoming the best textile worker or becoming the best scuba diver. And
Yeah.
maybe he would if those were the things that interest him, but they didn't interest him. The things that interest him were space and
Right.
technology. And it's because of that, his belief and his obedience to those things that he most wanted to do that have led him to all the successes he's had. And I think that that's a macrocosm of the microcosm that every individual one of us is going to experience if we allow ourselves to. If we allow ourselves the permission to go after the things that we most want to do until it becomes the thing that we most do and become successful at.
hmm Yeah, like you said earlier, it's just a matter of risk tolerance, right? I mean, there
Mhm.
was a Jim Carrey quote one time. I think he was at a high school graduation or college graduation, and he was speaking to the audience, and he talked about his father, who was an accountant, and he didn't enjoy it, but he did it because he wanted to pay the bills. And then his father was laid off, and then
Yeah.
so Jim Carrey said, that lesson, what that lesson taught him was that you could very well fail at the thing you hate doing. So you may as well just go do what you want to do. Because
Yeah.
if you fail at
Because
that, who cares, right?
that's what stops so many people from doing the thing they want to do because they think they might fail, right? And the
Yeah.
lesson is you can fail at anything. Why wouldn't you try to do something like why not reach for the stars and fall short instead of just
hmm
sitting down in the mud believing you can't?
hmm Absolutely. Yeah. And the other day I was talking to actually one of my jujitsu coaches and mentors in life, and I was talking with him about that debacle, or not debacle, but that situation we have to go back and forth between contentment and ambition, right? Because so I'm a Christian, right? I believe in a lot of biblical principles, and one of them is contentment. And so you want to be satisfied with where you're at in life, so that way you have some level of satisfaction of where you're at, and not being always depressed and upset and frustrated, annoyed, all those things. But at the same time, we have to be real with where we're at in society today, right? And I'm not talking too many politics here, but at the same time, like, it's just naturally, like, look at economics now, what's happening in the United States, in Canada, and in most of the parts of the world. Like, if you're just going to sit in your traditional 9 to 5, you're probably going to be left behind, because everything
Mhm.
cost of living wise just getting worse and worse. I mean, like, just look at the housing market, for instance, right? Like, the housing prices are going up at a much faster rate than what people are getting paid. So if you stay in the same job you're in, and you want to be able to afford a nice house one day, or whatever the case is, you want to have a good cost of, good way of life, you're going to have to do something in addition to that, most likely, in order to keep up. And it's just one of those things you have to deal with. So
Mhm.
but yeah, you made so many valid points, man. I don't really need to add much more to that. But um, so as you know, this podcast is called the Men of Principle Podcast, right? And so I want to ask you, what is one principle or character trait that you would like to see improved upon by men in our society today?
It's funny that you would ask that. Obviously, it is the modus operandi of the podcast itself, so I shouldn't be surprised that that question comes up. But it just so happens that I'm listening right now for the first time through Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and there's so many of them in there that I think all of us need to rehash and reassess as opposed to our own beliefs and our own convictions. One of the probably most easy ones for everybody to start improving upon, because I don't think anybody does this right. And it's not because we can't get better at it, but it's because it's so easy to just forget about it or
Mm,
just to fudge it from time to time. And that is to always tell the truth. And I think that that's something that all of society would benefit from. I mean, you can have hard truths that may hurt some people's feelings, or you may have some truths that could save some people's lives. But the opposite of that, there's two types of opposite. There's a straight up lie, or there is a lie of omission where you simply avoid the truth. And both of which just end up leading towards a world that is unrealistic. So, one of the things I talk about often on my podcast is the power of perception. And realistically, on planet Earth right now, we just recently crossed 8 billion people by population on planet Earth. Um, and when you think about that, you think, wow, we've got 8 billion people on one planet. Well, yes, but actually, no. What you actually have is 8 billion planets on one planet. You have 8 billion universes because every individual person perceives their environment based upon their own proprietary experience and environment. So
Mm,
that is going to change, affect, and dictate how they live in the same world that you're living in. But it can be a very, very different world. And most people don't realize that that's the case. They think that everybody lives in the world that they see, right?
mm,
And so by adjusting that paradigm, because you can never have a fully perfect resolved version of what reality is, only your best facsimile of what you can perceive around you, and that's just what we're stuck with. Sorry, your world is going to be slightly different than everybody's, and that's just what it is. But if you keep changing your world with lies, knowingly changing your world with lies, because here's the thing about lies too, you may start by thinking you're just fooling someone else, but to keep the lie up, you eventually have to internalize it and make it part of your reality. And so you're
mhm,
going to start building your superstructure of what you think the world is around lies. And to be able to exist cognitively at a subconscious level, you're going to have to believe at a very real, visceral level that what you're saying is true. And so, do you want to live in a world that is farther away from reality than reality itself? And that is the question that, first of all, everybody needs to wrestle with. And second of all, you need to recognize the dangers of, if you say, no, I don't want to live in that world, well, then stop lying, not only to other people, but to yourself.
mhm. Man, yeah, that's awesome. I don't know if I could agree with you more. Always tell the truth. That's such a great principle that it sounds so cliche, but how many people, like if they were to be truly honest with themselves for a moment, would realize that maybe they even lied to themselves today, or they lied to one of their loved ones today. And it could be something small, but small things can grow into bigger things. I was watching have you ever seen the movie Appaloosa with Ed
No,
Harris
no, I
and
don't think
Viggo
so.
Mortensen? Okay, yeah, it's a great movie. So I was watching it again the other night, and the main character Ed Harris, the one of the other characters in the movie had said something along the lines of, he always tells the truth, and she goes, "You've never lied before?" And he goes, "No, I've always thought the truth to be simpler. It's easier." And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it is, because not only for other people but to yourself, right? Like if you want to take a step towards progress and improving yourself every day, you have to be truthful to yourself most of all, right? So yeah, I'm with you, man. That's awesome. That's spot on.
Mm.
So, yeah, man, I really appreciate it. It's already been about 45 minutes now, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're a very busy man with all the things that you have going on, but again, I want to take this time to say thank you for being on the podcast. So, for those who don't currently follow you, or if someone wants to go look at your hilarious memes, or listen to your podcast, or even get some awesome merchandise like your Because Jiu-Jitsu stuff, where can they go find you?
Definitely. So, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I had a blast, and I'd be happy to come back anytime. Maybe I'll get you on mine too.
That'd be
So,
awesome.
if you want listeners out there to listen to my podcast, it's called the Social Disorder Podcast. You can get it on all podcasting platforms: Apple Podcast, Spotify, all the good stuff. If you want to check out the memes, they're mostly on Instagram. You can go to at because_jitsu. And I've got my personal account that you'll see up in the bio up there, drew.weatherhead, where it's got most of my jujitsu stuff. I've got a podcast page there as well. And then if you want to, if what you're hearing interests you and you want to get deeper into some of the topics that I talk about, I go really deep in my book, which is called Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose. And like most of what we talked about today is in that purpose section, that last section, but some really fascinating stuff on the topics of consciousness and reality as well. So if you want to check that out, it's available on Amazon in hard copy and paperback, as well as on Audible if you want to hear me read it to you.
That's awesome. And just to make it easy for you guys too, I'll make sure to put a link in the description of this podcast to all of those things that Drew just said. I follow him on basically every platform, and as well as his podcast. So I'll make sure to go ahead and put that in our podcast when we're done. So But again, Drew, thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope to talk to you again, Drew. It was great having you.
Absolutely.
You're certainly a man of principle in my book, and I appreciate having you on, man. So everyone else, thank you and have a great day.